Hi guys, I'm back again, and today's short lesson is about primary and secondary sources. So, in the introductory video where we talked about your syllabus, you probably heard me talk a lot about primary sources and secondary sources. And while some of you may have known what they are or know what they are, others may be like, what is this voodoo that she speaks of? Don't worry, don't let your head explode. Primary and secondary sources are excellent resources in historical research. So in this very short lesson, you're going to learn what a primary source is, what a secondary source is, and why they're useful. All right, so let's get started. Get a pen, a paper, or your laptop, or whatever you take notes on, and let's start this lesson. And as always, remember the lecture notes are on your online learning platform. So let's get started. Okay, so what is a primary source? A primary source is any source that provides direct or first-hand evidence of a person or an event. Primary sources take place or are developed during that particular event. So examples of primary sources include historical and legal documents. So for example, court paperwork, that would be a primary source. Eyewitness accounts, results of experiments. If you're interested in the Tuskegee experiment, for example, you may find the results of that experiment. That would be a primary source. Statistical data, so census information, that would be an example of statistical data. I use census information and historical research quite often to find out where people are, who is living in the household, and things such as that. Also, pieces of creative writing can be primary sources, as well as audio and video recordings and interviews. That's a primary source. Speeches, art objects can even be a primary source. Another example, well, I said interviews, for example, were primary sources. So while I was in grad school, I did some research on Black domestics in the Jim Crow South. And my grandmother was a domestic in the Jim Crow South in Jim Crow, Texas. And so I conducted an oral history or an interview with her. And I was able to use that interview in my paper about Black domestics in the Jim Crow South. That source from my grandmother, because it is an interview and it provides direct firsthand evidence of her experience of being a Black domestic in the Jim Crow South, that interview is a primary source. So primary sources provide firsthand evidence. So what's a secondary source? What makes these things different? A secondary source is information that was created at a later time by someone who didn't experience the event firsthand or participate in the events or conditions that you're researching. So examples of secondary sources, a great example would be your Give Me Liberty textbook. Eric Foner is not 400 years old. He was not alive during the times of pre-colonial or pre-Columbian contact, but he has gathered information into this book. So this is secondary. Books are a great example of secondary sources. For example, this book that I'm reading, They Were Her Property, that I mentioned in another video. Stephanie Jones Rogers uses a number of primary sources in order to compile this, but this book itself is a secondary source. Now, a lot of historians use a number of primary and secondary sources when they are writing works such as this. Where do you find these sources? Because on one of your book reviews, in the second to last paragraph, it's like what type, I asked for what types of sources were used in compiling the work. So how do we find this information? Very easy. Every historical book or book that is based on research has a section in the back for notes. And in this section, they have essentially every source that they used in every part of the book. And so you'll notice that a number of these sources are, for example, primary. However, secondary sources, again, include books, academic and scholarly articles and journals. So, for example, if you were to read something from the Journal of African American History, an article, that would be a secondary source. Journal articles, scholarly articles and texts, books are all secondary information. Primary sources take place during the time and provide firsthand evidence. So I'll do a short quiz. So let's say you are doing some research on the American Revolution and the role that women played and the opinions that women had during the American Revolution, and you find a number of letters written by women from the years 1770 to 1783. Okay, would that be a primary source or a secondary source? Time's up. That would be a primary source because these letters provide direct or firsthand evidence of this event. So I'll give another example. Let's say, like me, you decide to do family history and you want to find out where your second great-grandfather lived, and so you look him up and you find him in a census from the year 1930. Is that a primary source or a secondary source? Time's up. That would be a primary source because it is statistical data, and all statistical data is a primary source. Okay, another one. So you guys have to do a book review on the book Revolutionary Women. Okay, so is the book Revolutionary Women a primary source or a secondary source? All right, you got 5 seconds. The book is a secondary source. However, again, in a number of historical writings, the authors may use a number of primary sources in compiling the secondary work. Okay? If you guys have any other questions, hit me up, send me an email, and we'll get through this semester together. So I'll be offering examples of primary sources and secondary sources, but it's pretty easy to understand. I know you guys got it. So remember, I know you don't hate history. You just hate how you've been taught history. So let's do this different. All right? I'll see you guys later.